Fern Feather was known as a kind, free spirit, someone who loved birds, flowers, animals, and making the people around her feel seen. Then, in April 2022, she stopped to help a man who was hitchhiking. Days later, Fern was dead. The man who admitted to stabbing her was charged with second-degree murder and faced a possible life sentence. But nearly 3 years later, after the trial finally began, the case suddenly unraveled. And instead of a murder conviction, Fern's killer walked out on probation. This is the story of Fern Feather, and the question so many were left asking. How did this happen? Welcome back to Their Voice Matters. I'm Amanda, and here we cover true crime stories with clarity and care, always centering the people whose voices deserve to be heard. If that matters to you, I'd love to have you here. So please be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast. It really does help these stories reach more people. Before we get into Fern's story, I want to briefly note that Fern was a transgender woman. Most sources refer to Fern using she, her pronouns, though some sources and quotes use different pronouns. Fern's parents and some news outlets said she used all pronouns. For consistency, I'll be using she, her pronouns throughout this episode, while preserving direct quotes as they were originally reported. With all that said, I want to start with who Fern was. Fern Feather was described as a kind, free spirit who loved plants, bugs, and animals, especially birds. One of her favorite hobbies was photographing them and sharing her pictures online with friends. She loved the outdoors, was adventurous, and enjoyed traveling. Friends said she had a way of finding beauty in places and people that others might overlook. They also said Fern had a gift for making people feel seen. Friend Suzanne Podheiser said Fern would, quote, make you feel like you were lovely, and would compliment your hair or skirt or toenails. Whatever it was that was bright about you, she would notice and illuminate it. Another friend recalled, quote, I can't think of a single bad thing to say about Fern. When we'd go out to anywhere, if anyone was silently suffering, Fern would go over to them and make them feel important and make them feel valued. Violence seemed completely at odds with who Fern was. Friends said she even disliked casual expressions involving harm. Rather than saying, kill 2 birds with 1 stone, Fern would say, plant 2 flowers with 1 seed. In April 2022, 29-year-old Fern was living in Hinesburg, Vermont, about half an hour southeast of Burlington. Friend Murphy Robinson said, quote, she was part of the town, a fixture, someone that everybody knows. A close friend, described by one outlet as Fern's partner, Jennifer Toma, described Fern as, quote, an amazing individual who brought so much light and love and authenticity and magic to this world. Another friend, Brittany Tetlow, remembered Fern this way, quote, every time I saw Fern, they had a wildflower in their hair, but they didn't need the accessory. They were a wildflower themselves. Always in full bloom, bringing joy and happiness to everybody around them. Just a few weeks before her death, on March 24th, 2022, Fern shared a post on Facebook announcing that she was a transgender woman. The post read, quote, it's time to tell the world I'm a hot trans woman in a currently male hot body suit. Dang sure took long enough, eh? Please share this to liberate our other beautiful ones. Just a few weeks later, Fern's life would intersect with someone she had never met before. In April 2022, Fern was driving when she noticed a man hitchhiking along the road. The man was 43-year-old Seth Brunell. Fern pulled over and offered him a ride. At the time, there was no reason to think the encounter would be anything other than a simple act of kindness. According to reports, Brunell had recently left the state-run Vermont Psychiatric Care Hospital in Berlin, Vermont, where he had reportedly checked himself in several days earlier due to mental health concerns. He was barefoot and walking toward nearby Interstate 89 when Fern stopped to help him. Over the next several days, the two spent time together, and Fern was excited about the new friendship. In a text message to friend Eliza Curtis, Fern wrote, quote, Seth isn't gay. He's just a new awesome friend, life partner. People close to Fern didn't seem concerned about the relationship. Jennifer Toma later recalled that Seth seemed, quote, like a good guy, and described him as, quote, a special friend. Nothing about the friendship seemed unusual, but within days, everything would change. What began as a simple act of kindness would ultimately have devastating consequences. At around 8 a.m. on Tuesday, April 12, 2022, the Lamoille County Sheriff's Department received a report about a suspicious vehicle parked outside the local school district offices. According to the caller, the vehicle had been sitting in the parking lot for some time, and there was someone inside smoking a cigarette. 2 deputies responded and found Fern and Seth Brunell sitting in the vehicle. They told deputies they were looking for a place to walk their dogs. During the interaction, Brunell reportedly told police he had recently been released from a mental health facility and had also been cited by state police for stealing a vehicle. After speaking with them, deputies stayed in the parking lot and watched as Fern and Brunell drove away. About an hour later, around 9:15 a.m., Fern's friend Eliza Curtis invited Fern and Brunell to join her for coffee. Fern declined. Later, Eliza would say their conversation seemed completely normal and that nothing stood out as unusual. But less than an hour later, everything changed. At approximately 10 a.m., Eliza received a call from Fern's phone, but it wasn't Fern on the line. It was Seth Brunell. According to Eliza, Brunell told her that he had killed Fern. She recalled him saying that Fern, quote, had come on to me and was going crazy. At nearly the same time, a woman named Karen Cleary was driving down Dumel Road and saw something alarming. A person was laying motionless on the side of the road. Standing nearby was a man holding a phone. That man was Seth Brunell. Karen pulled over to see what was happening. At this point, Eliza was still on the phone with Brunell. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, Karen called 911. Within minutes, first responders arrived on the scene. Fern was laying face up on the roadside, covered in blood. The two dogs were still beside her. Nearby, Brunell sat waiting in the vehicle. As officers approached Brunell, he immediately began explaining what he claimed had happened. According to investigators, Brunell said over the several days he knew Fern, she had repeatedly made unwanted romantic and sexual advances toward him, and that he had repeatedly rejected them. He claimed those advances had become increasingly frequent. Brunell told investigators that he had been sitting in the passenger seat, while Fern was sitting in the driver's seat. According to officers, Brunell claimed that Fern leaned across the center console toward him. He then grabbed a knife and stabbed Fern in the chest. He continued pushing on the knife as Fern was pushed from the driver's side of the vehicle and onto the roadway. Brunell maintained that he was acting in self-defense and that Fern had, quote, attacked him. According to police, he told them, quote, I told Fern I wasn't gay. I was just protecting myself. However, investigators said they found no evidence supporting Brunell's claim that he had been attacked. State police later said, quote, investigators observed no injuries or evidence of a struggle or an assault on Brunell. Authorities also noted that his clothing was clean and undamaged. A short distance away, officers found a 12-inch knife, covered in blood. When Fern's body was taken for an autopsy, the medical examiner determined that she had died from a stab wound to the chest. Her death was ruled a homicide. Brunell was taken into custody and held without bail. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree murder. If convicted, he faced a potential sentence of up to life in prison. At his arraignment, Brunell pleaded not guilty. For Fern's friends, the allegations made against her were almost as shocking as her death. They described Fern as gentle, compassionate, and deeply opposed to violence. Many publicly rejected Brunell's version of events, insisting there was no way Fern would have attacked anyone. And as more details emerged, the case began to take on a much larger meaning. To Fern's friends, this wasn't just the loss of someone they loved. It was also a painful reminder of the violence and stigma transgender people continue to face. Fern's death sent shockwaves through Vermont's LGBTQ+ community, her local community, and eventually far beyond it. As more people learned what happened, advocates and community members began calling for the case to be investigated as a hate crime. A Change.org petition supporting that push gathered more than 9,000 signatures. Authorities said they would pursue a hate crime charge if the evidence supported it. Deputy State's Attorney Aliana Gerhardt said, quote, we are getting new evidence every day, and if the evidence presented to us supports the charge of a hate crime, we will certainly pursue it. But ultimately, no hate crime charge was ever filed. Gerhardt later said, quote, the evidence is not sufficient to sustain a hate crime conviction. That distinction is important. The absence of a hate crime charge doesn't necessarily mean authorities believed bias played no role in the case. It means the prosecution didn't believe they had enough evidence to prove that charge in court. Still, for many people following Fern's case, the circumstances of her death felt impossible to separate from the broader violence faced by transgender people. State House Speaker, Representative Jill Krawinski, said Fern was, quote, tragically taken from this world too soon. Like so many other transgender people who are targeted in bias-driven attacks, we absolutely need to continue to take steps to make Vermont a more equitable place and be clear that hate has no place in our state. Governor Phil Scott spoke publicly after Fern's death, saying, quote, exploiting fear and targeting divisive rhetoric at people who are just trying to be who they are is hateful and can lead to violence. To Vermonters in the LGBTQA+ community, I want you to know we stand with you and support you, but know we have more work to do. Senate President pro tempore Becca Balint, the highest-ranking openly gay person to ever serve in state legislature, said, quote, "As we look across the nation, LGBTQ kids and adults are under siege, and it touches me personally." And Fern's death happened in a broader context that advocates had been warning about for years. Studies show that transgender people in the United States are 4 times more likely than cisgender people to be the victims of violent crime. The U.S. ranks 3rd, behind Brazil and Mexico, for the highest number of reported murders of transgender people. And among transgender women who are victims of violent crime, 1 in 4 believed the incident was a hate crime, compared to fewer than 1 in 10 cisgender women. But even those numbers may not tell the full story, because researchers believe that many crimes against transgender people are never reported to police. Just 1 year before Fern's death, Vermont had enacted a law banning what is often called the LGBTQ panic defense. That kind of defense attempts to argue that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity somehow explains or excuses the violence against them. Vermont's law specifically applies to, quote, "circumstances in which the victim made a non-forcible, non-criminal romantic or sexual advance towards the defendant." Representative Taylor Small, the bill's co-sponsor and Vermont's first openly transgender lawmaker, said, quote, "A victim should never be blamed for a crime that is committed against them, especially if it is because of a marginalized identity that they hold." And that law would become especially relevant in Fern's case, because Brunell's version of events centered on the claim that Fern had made an advance towards him, a claim that investigators said was not supported by the evidence. As this case moved forward, more attention was turned to Brunell himself, his past, his recent history, and what Fern may or may not have known about him. Not much has been publicly reported about Seth Brunell's personal background, but what is known raised serious questions. In 2004, Brunell was convicted of aggravated assault after stabbing a man with a kitchen knife and severely wounding him. It was reported that the two had been fighting over a woman before the attack. Brunell pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 11 to 12 months in prison. Then, in 2010, Brunell was convicted of grand larceny after robbing a convenience store of $2,200 in cash. He was sentenced to 30 days to 18 months in prison. While we don't know the exact date Fern and Brunell met, investigators believe they were together for at least 2 days before the tragedy that unfolded on April 12th. As mentioned earlier, Brunell had reportedly been admitted to the hospital for psychiatric treatment after an attempt to take his own life. After being discharged, Fern found him hitchhiking nearby and gave him a ride. At the time, Brunell was not known to have a fixed address. Whether Fern knew any of this, we don't know. What we do know is that Fern seemed to believe she had made a new friend. While Brunell awaited trial, he remained in custody, and the case began moving through the court system. But it did not move quickly. Instead, there were delays, complications, and several issues that would raise questions about how the case was being handled. In April 2023, about a year after Fern's death, Brunell attempted to escape from prison. According to reports, he knotted sheets together and tried to scale a fence, but he was unsuccessful. That escape attempt would become another charge on top of the second-degree murder charge he was already facing. Then, in September 2024, another issue came to light. The prosecution was supposed to provide the defense a 3D rendering of the crime scene, but instead, they accidentally sent over a rendering from a completely different case. The prosecution apologized for the mistake, but Brunell's defense attorney, Jessica Burke, filed a motion asking the court to dismiss the case based on that error. Presiding Judge Mary Morrissey denied that request. The case would not be thrown out. But the mistake did lead to yet another delay, and it wouldn't be the last issue before trial. This time, the problem involved a 20-page letter allegedly written by Brunell while he was in prison in 2023. In that letter, Brunell allegedly outlined a plan to have an intimate encounter with his attorney, Jessica Burke, and then accuse her of SA, all in an attempt to have the case dismissed. Assistant Attorney General Sophie Stratton wanted to use that letter as evidence in the trial. But there was a problem. The state was trying to introduce it late, claiming prosecutors had only recently learned about it. However, it was revealed that state police had known about the letter for months. Judge Morrissey ruled that the letter could not be admitted. She found that it violated the time limits for introducing evidence, and allowing it in so late would not give the defense enough time to properly respond. By that point, the case had already been delayed multiple times, and according to reports, Brunell's own attorney said it was the most disorganized case she'd ever experienced. Still, despite all those issues, the case was finally headed to trial. It wouldn't be until April 2025, 3 years after Fern's death, that Seth Brunell's second-degree murder trial finally began. By then, Brunell was 46 years old. He had been in custody since April 2022, and if he was convicted of Fern's murder, he faced a possible sentence of life in prison. Jury selection began on Monday, April 14, 2025. Jurors were selected that day, and opening statements began the next morning, Tuesday, April 15th. The trial was expected to last about a week. From the beginning, the central question was not whether Brunell had killed Fern. He had admitted that he stabbed her. The question was whether the jury would believe his claim that he'd acted in self-defense. Prosecutors argued that the evidence did not support Brunell's version of events. When officers arrived at the scene, they found no injuries on Brunell and no evidence that he'd been attacked. In her opening statement, Assistant Attorney General Sophie Stratton encouraged jurors to use, quote, good judgment and, quote, common sense when deciding whether Brunell's actions were justified. But the defense had a very different strategy. Brunell's attorney, Jessica Burke, argued that investigators had focused too quickly on Brunell and failed to fully examine evidence that could have supported his claim of self-defense. She told the jury, quote, officers in this case used tunnel vision and cherry-picking of evidence to get here. Burke argued that Brunell had been charged with murder before the scene had even been fully processed. She also expanded on Brunell's self-defense claim, saying he had been attacked with scissors after refusing Fern's advances. According to Burke, Brunell's clothing and the scissors he claimed he was attacked with were never tested for DNA. She argued this testing could have supported his version of events. Burke told jurors, quote, they didn't slow down and assess the evidence. I submit that if they had, they would have found that Seth acted in self-defense. She also questioned how the crime scene had been handled. According to the defense, Fern and Brunell's 2 dogs were allowed to roam around the scene for about an hour after officers arrived, potentially contaminating evidence. Burke also pointed to markings on the dirt road that she argued could have been signs of a struggle, saying those markings were never properly investigated. At first, the trial seemed to be moving forward normally. Witnesses were called, evidence was introduced. Both sides began laying out their version of what happened that morning. And then suddenly, everything changed. A revelation came to light that would derail the entire trial and completely alter the outcome of Fern's case. On Tuesday, April 15th, it was revealed that a Lamoille County Sheriff's deputy had a recorded conversation with Brunell about the case, while transporting him from court to prison after jury selection the day before. Vermont State Police Detective Sergeant Isaac Merriam testified that he had asked the Sheriff's Department to use a body camera during the transport. He told the court, quote, I wanted to make sure that the transport was recorded in case Mr. Brunell made statements about the case. Lamoille County Sheriff's Department Detective Kevin Leho testified that he instructed Sheriff's Deputy Christopher Turner to record the transport. Turner had reportedly been with the Sheriff's Department for just over a year. Leho said he did not instruct Turner to ask Brunell questions about the case, but he also admitted that he had not specifically told him not to. When asked about that, Leho said, quote, I didn't at the time, no, and I didn't expect that I would have to. But according to the transcript of the trip, Brunell was questioned about the case. Those questions reportedly included details about Fern's car, the knife, what Brunell claimed he was afraid of during the attack, and his relationship with his attorney, likely connected to the prison letter Brunell had allegedly written. According to reports, Brunell answered those questions, quote, candidly, and that created an enormous legal problem. Brunell had invoked his right to an attorney. Once someone has invoked that right, law enforcement is not supposed to question them about the case without the presence of their counsel. Because of that, Brunell's attorney, Jessica Burke, immediately filed a motion for a mistrial. In that motion, she argued that the recording had been, quote, obtained in violation of his Miranda rights, to his right to counsel, and in violation of attorney-client privilege. Both the prosecution and defense described what happened as, quote, egregious. Burke called it a, quote, scheme to obtain evidence of defendant's statements to use against him during the pending trial. The issue put the entire case in jeopardy. Prosecutors later said they were concerned that if a judge granted a mistrial, they might not be able to refile charges against Brunell, and that he could ultimately walk free. After years of delays, discovery problems, excluded evidence, and now this recorded transport conversation, prosecutors were facing a devastating possibility. Fern's case could end with no conviction at all. By the end of the day, on Wednesday, April 16th, both sides had agreed to a plea deal. Lamoille County State's Attorney Gerhard said, quote, we believe it was in the best interest of the family to have a conviction and to have supervision for a decade. She also said, quote, it's devastating. I can say that. I was pretty angry. Burke later said, quote, "My client and I and the state were all prepared to see this trial through. That was everyone's intent. That was everyone's goal. But unfortunately, due to this unconstitutional behavior on the part of law enforcement, we were suddenly left without a path forward to try the case." On Thursday, April 17th, Judge Mary Morrissey accepted the plea deal. Brunell pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 to 10 years in prison, but that sentence was suspended, meaning that Brunell was not required to immediately serve that sentence. Instead, it would remain hanging over him while he was on probation. If he violated the conditions of his probation, that prison sentence could be imposed. As part of his probation, Brunell was prohibited from consuming alcohol or drugs without a prescription. He was also prohibited from possessing firearms and was required to wear an electronic monitoring device during his probation. As part of the deal, he was sentenced to serve 18 months in prison. But because Brunell had already spent about 3 years in custody awaiting trial, that time was considered served. So, in practical terms, he would not serve any additional prison time. Instead, he was released under a 10-year probation sentence. The attempted escape charge was also included in the plea deal. During the sentencing, Brunell addressed Fern's family, saying, quote, "We don't know what happened that day, and there's no excuses, and that's not a sickness I'd wish on anybody. I'm sorry for what happened that day, and I don't expect any forgiveness." Fern's family was devastated. Her mother, Lisa Barbeau, addressed Brunell in court, saying, quote, "You were able to end his life, but you will never be able to extinguish the light that he brought into the world. The only reason you're getting out now is because of the gross negligence of the Lamoille County Sheriff's Department, because you are a murderer." Fern's father, Jean-Francois Barbeau, was even more direct. He said, quote, "This isn't justice. It's a pitiful parody of justice. Thank you all." After the trial collapsed, Sheriff's Deputy Christopher Turner, the deputy who recorded and questioned Brunell during the transport, was placed on administrative leave while his actions were investigated. He was later fired from the Sheriff's Department. Then, in June 2026, it was reported that Turner had been indicted by a grand jury on 3 charges: 2 counts of obstruction of justice and 1 count of false swearing. Turner pleaded not guilty. But even with the continued fallout of the trial, Fern's story is not just about the court case, the plea deal, or the deputy who helped derail it. It's also about who Fern was and how deeply she was loved. After everything that happened, Fern's loved ones wanted people to remember more than just the way she died. They wanted people to remember who she was. Fern's father, Jean-Francois Barbeau, said, quote, "Tell your people you love them. Appreciate the moments with them because you never know." And Murphy Robinson, a friend of Fern's, pushed back against any idea that Fern could be forgotten. Speaking about Brunell, Murphy said, quote, "Did he think that because Fern was trans that this would be a throwaway person that nobody cared about? Because that couldn't have been more far from the truth. She was so deeply loved." An obituary for Fern described her as, quote, "a star being beyond gender and made of light." And that is what I want to leave you with. Fern was not a headline. She was not a court case. She was not the controversy surrounding the sentence. She was a child, a friend, a part of her community, and someone who made the people around her feel seen. She loved birds, flowers, animals, and the natural world. She noticed what was bright in other people. And according to the people who loved her, she brought light, love, authenticity, and magic into the world. So even though this case ended in a way that devastated Fern's family and community, her story does not end with Seth Brunell. It continues on with the people who still remember her, the people who still say her name, and the people who refuse to let her beautiful memory be overshadowed by the way she died. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Fern's case in the comments, but please keep the conversation respectful and focused on Fern, her case, and the outcome. If you found this episode meaningful, please be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast. It really does help these stories reach more people. And if you want to check out another case where a killer was held accountable, but the victim's loved ones are still left without full closure, I recommend checking out my episode on Lauren Kidd's case. I'll link it here and in the description. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring, because these stories matter. I'll see you in the next episode.